Hello there! We hope you're having a great day. I'm Francis Yael Bondoc, and with me today are my groupmates Arielle and Chua and Leanne Mae Tanquilut. In this video, we'll be discussing an enquiry concerning human understanding by David Hume from sections 2 to 5 and 7. To proceed with our discussion, let's start with section 2 of the origin of ideas. Next slide, please. In this slide, we see two pictures. The first one shows a woman smelling the dish she's cooking in the kitchen, and the next one showing the same woman recalling or thinking about when she smelled the dish. Both of these are perceptions of the mind, the first one being the experience itself, and the second one being a recollection. Now, we may notice that our actual experiences, may it be from our senses or emotions, are very much lively and vivid in our minds during the moment we experience them. However, after that moment, we now notice that when we recall from our memories the experience perceived in our minds, it is exact, but it is not as lively and vivid. So to say, we know there's a difference between the two of them. We know which is the actual experience and which one is a mere recollection. Unless one suffers from a disease or disorder, that of course hinders them from knowing the difference. For example, schizophrenia, psychosis, or brain tumors or other disease or illnesses that can cause hallucinations. Thus, David Hume says, the most lively thought is still inferior to the dullest sensation. And he suggested that the perceptions of the mind are distinguishable from one another through their different degrees of force and vivacity, or what we described earlier as the quality of being lively and vivid. And to give name to these perceptions, David Hume called them impressions and ideas. Impressions are more vivacious, more forcible, because they are the experience themselves, the sensation or the movements, while the ideas are less vivacious and less forcible, for they are just the perceptions we have when recalling past experiences. Now, we may think that the thought is unbounded and it has no limits, because we can form ideas of monsters by simply joining shapes and figures. Or the mind can go to places where the body has not been yet, for example, the moon. It may seem that thought is unbounded, however, this is wrong. Throughout this lesson, we're going to figure out that the power of thought is no more than the faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, and diminishing what is provided by the senses. For the next part of section 2, Leanne.
Hello, I am Leanne Mae Tanquilut, and I will be discussing the second part of section 2. So to prove Hume's claims that all ideas are copies of our impressions or more lively ones, there are two arguments that will support this claim. For the first argument, it just says that all our ideas are just derived from a precedent feeling or an impression. For example, he used the idea of God that his qualities such as all-knowing, powerful, kind, and etc. came from our own operations of mind, that all good qualities should be given to someone who is known as powerful. Although this example only applies in this reading and do not represent the idea of others in this example. For the second argument, Hume used a defective man as an example. And here he stated that if one did not experience something, he wouldn't be able to know or have an idea about it. So, for example, a blind man cannot see, thus, he does not have an idea which color is which, and this goes the same for a deaf person. This just supports the main idea that ideas must come from impressions. However, there's this one phenomenon that contradicts the first two arguments that Hume proposed. Here, he gave a single situation wherein it is not impossible for an idea to arise without impressions. For example, a man knowing the different shades of color blue as he grows older. However, there's this one shade that wasn't shown to him ever in his life. Hume stated that it will be possible for him to guess or have a clue of this shade by just observing the other shades of beside it. This proves that ideas can arise without deriving from a direct impression. Even though this is just a single situation, it is not enough to completely alter the first two arguments or the main idea of Hume. So let us now hear from Ariane, who will be discussing section 3.
Hello, so I'm Arielle, and I shall be discussing sections 3 and 4 of David Hume's An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. So, section 3 of the Association of Ideas. Now, Hume stated that there is an observable connection between the ideas or thoughts we have in our minds and their appearances in our memories. Even in vague conversations, we're able to see the connections between different ideas. Now, because of this statement, he formulated the three principles of connection. Now, let us first start with resemblance. Now, these are two ideas that are associated by the resemblance to another. Now, let's say, for example, a picture. If we think of a picture, our thoughts will lead us to the original. We may first think of a picture of our family, or maybe with friends, or maybe a solo picture of yourself. Now, keep in mind that we will always revert back to the original person, the original physical being. For continuity in time or place. Connections forming depend on the close proximity or their time or in place. Now, these are two ideas that are said to be contiguous when they effectively touch. Now, let's say, for example, there are two apartments that share a wall. They are separate apartments, sure, but they share something. Next is the cause or effect. Now, these are ideas and thoughts that are basically connected to one another. Now, for example, wound and pain. Now, the wound is what causes the pain. So it's just pretty simple. Now, ideas would be disconnected without these principles of association, which ensure the coherency and uniformity. The imagination of faculty is in charge of not only organizing, assembling, and disassembling ideas, but also associating some of them on a regular basis. With these three principles, we must examine the connections we face in our day to day lives. According to Hume, the more instances we examine and the more care we employ, the more assurance shall we acquire, and that the enumeration which we form from the whole is complete. Now let us move on to section 4, the skeptical doubts concerning the operations of understanding. Human knowledge concerns either the following. There are two types of object of human reasoning, which are relations of ideas and matters of fact. Now, for relations of ideas, these are the affirmations wherein, according to Hume, they are demonstratively certain. In layman's terms, this is the knowledge wherein it is purely conceptual and logic. Now, for example, this is where we get our math, our Pythagorean theorem, our geometry. Now, these are facts, these are ideas rather, that doesn't concern the facts in the world. Next are the matter of facts. These are contingent truths, meaning that a true proposition could be false. Now, for example, the sun will not rise tomorrow. The contradiction could not be easily demonstrated, but rather I need to look outside the window the next day to prove the falsehood of my statement. Now, the relation of cause and effect is the foundation of all reasonings concerning cause and effect. We can go beyond the evidence of our senses and memory. Now, for example, a man believes that his friend is in France. When asked why he believes such, his response may be because of his prior knowledge that his friend has mentioned it, or he sent him a letter stating that his departure. And also another example would be a man that finds a watch in a desert island. He may conclude that there have been men on the island. Now, one may ask, how do we arrive from the knowledge of cause and effect? Not by reasoning, but by experience. Now, for example, if you give water to Adam, he could not conclude that it could drown him, or if he was shown fire, he could not conclude that it could burn him. He could not find out any of these unless he experiences them. Now, let's go on to part two. Now, each solution gives rise to a new question, as difficult as the original, and leads us on to further inquiries. Our reasonings concerning the matters of facts are founded on the relation of cause and effect. Conclusions of that relations are founded on experience. When then is the foundation of all conclusions from experience? Now, Hume emphasizes that people are unaware of the connection between the object's sensible qualities and their secret powers. Let us say, for example, bread. One may inform us of the color and consistency of bread, but cannot inform us of the qualities on why bread is good for the body. There is no connection between the qualities and powers. And there is no reason why past experiences should be extended to the future. Just because bread can nourish a person one time, it doesn't mean it could nourish a person again. Bread's qualities do not reveal its nutritive properties. As a result, these qualities are quote unquote secret. Second, Hume emphasizes that experiences are not entirely are entirely separate, rather. What Hume is saying is that conclusions drawn from experience are not rationally justified. They cannot be justified through relations of ideas or matters of facts. Which is why, with experience, there must be reasoning. Now, these are the two types of reasoning. This is the demonstrative reasoning, which concerns the relation of ideas, and the moral reasoning, which concerns the matters of facts and existence. Our arguments from experience can go no further than to show that similar causes lead us to expect similar effects. There is no process of reasoning which would draw a different conclusion from one instance from that which it infers from 100 instances. We cannot prove our predictions of the past, which are merely based on inductive reasoning. Thus, Hume's acknowledged that difficulty in developing an argument for a rational basis for casual reasoning and challenges others to do them. Now, let us hear from Leanne, who shall be discussing section 5.
Next, we will have section 5, which is entitled The Skeptical Solutions of These Doubts. This will cover two parts. For the first part, we will tackle the principle of custom or habit, and for the second part, we will have the belief and principles of connection of association. So in here, there are two types of people. Next slide, please. A person without experience and a person who has acquired more experience. To start this topic, let us first imagine a person who went to Earth without having any idea of anything. In short, he has no experience about anything. Hume said in here that even though he can immediately start to observe succession of objects, still he wouldn't be able to discover anything beyond that. Why? This is because he's not capable of reaching the idea of cause and effect. It has been stated a while ago that the idea of cause and effect happens when a person is capable of concluding by just basing on by just basing on the event that has happened in the past and may happen in the future. In this case, he wouldn't be able to do this because he has no experience. So if we look at the second type of person, it can be said that what will happen to him will be the opposite of the other. Since he has more experience and has lived longer to have compared a lot of objects or events that constantly connects together, he will immediately be able to infer the existence of one object from the appearance of the other. This example is the effect of custom. Next slide, please. Now let's take a look at the principle of habit or custom or habit. It states here that it is the repetition of any particular act or operation that produces a propensity. So what is propensity? Propensity here means that someone is determined to draw inferences only after repeated similar experiences without being impelled by any reasoning or process of understanding. He also said that custom is a great guide to human life because this principle alone makes our experiences very useful and makes us expect for the future using the experiences alone. Also, it allows people to go beyond their memories and senses. However, we must always remember that fact should always be present to the senses or memory before proceeding and drawing conclusions in order to avoid reasonings that are merely hypothetical. Next slide, please. So, what is the conclusion of the whole matter? All belief of matter of fact or real existence is derived merely from one object present to the memory or senses and a customary conjunction between that and some other object. To simply put this, we seem to find a connection between two different things. For example, flame and heat and snow and cold. These things have always been conjoined together. The principle of custom makes our mind carried to that kind of belief. Therefore, Hume believes that all inferences from experiences are the effects of custom, not of reasoning. Next slide, please. So let us now move on to the part 2, the belief and principles of connection or association. So let us first differentiate belief and fiction or imagination. Fiction, as we all know, is not true and is just a product of our minds. The concept of imagination is believing anything, whatever it pleases. It has the command over all its ideas and makes them in every way it likes. For example, we can connect the a head of a man to a body of a horse or vice versa. However, in belief, it lies in some sentiment or feeling and does not depend on the will of the mind. It must be excited by nature and must arise from a particular situation. It is more vivid, lively, firm, and a steady conception of an object that what the imagination alone is ever be able to attain. Next slide, please. So, according to Hume, belief is something that's felt by the mind, which distinguishes the ideas of judgment from fictions of imagination. So, in other words, belief is not under anyone's control. It is not willed, but instead a natural state of human. It is a way of conceptualizing something that results from a regular connection of the object with something already in the memory or present to the senses. So, for example, someone hears a person's voice that he or she is acquainted with at the other room. The impression of the senses immediately conveys the thought to the person, together with all the surrounding objects. These are together painted out at the present in the mind of the person, together with the qualities the person already knew in the past. This is a very different feeling and has much greater influence than a mere imagination of things that aren't true. Next slide, please. So for the next slide, we have the three principles of connection or association, which are resemblance, contiguity, and causation or the cause and effect. Earlier, it was mentioned that belief is the natural state of humans. Now we go on to the three principles of connections that were already discussed earlier in section 3. We go back in this part because Hume said that it is not only that we have belief going on, we also have this customary habit taking place in relation to resemblance, contiguity, and causation. He asked if something happens when one of the objects presented to the senses of memory, the mind is not only carried to the conception of the correlative, but reaches a steadier and stronger conception of it than what otherwise it would have been able to attain. Hume examined this by considering some examples. So, in resemblance, he analyzed the way the devotees to the relics of saints in the Roman Catholic religion. In contiguity, he gave an example of a person who is far from home and whatever relates to it gives bigger impact than when a person is just 200 leagues distant. And lastly, in the idea of causation or cause and effect, an object that is owned by the son of a friend who had been long dead instantly goes back to our thoughts of all past intimacy and familiarities. He later on realized that belief of correlative object is always presupposed in these examples without which the relation could have no effect. Next slide, please. So, in conclusion, the three principles are the only bonds that unite our thoughts together and beget that regular chain of reflection or discourse which, in a greater or less degree, takes place among all mankind. So, this means that these are the three main ways in which we connect our ideas together and move from one which is present to another which is absent, bringing them into a range of our thought, and this is what Hume called the matters of fact. Let us now call Jael to discuss this part.
To proceed with section 7 of the idea of necessary connection, next slide please. Hume states that there are no more obscure and uncertain ideas in metaphysics other than those of power, force, energy, and necessary connection. In Hume's work, he tries to define these terms in order to clear up some of the obscurity that causes confusion in philosophy. Now, since ideas are the source or the copies of impressions, Hume attempted to understand the idea of power by finding its source, or the impression. Hume presented three possible places in which where we could find the impression of idea of power. Next slide, please. For the first one, external objects. Considering the operations of causes, we can never discover the quality, the so-called power or necessary connection that binds the cause and effect. For example, when a billiard ball is set to motion towards a second billiard ball, we expect the second billiard ball to move as well. But why? When we see an object for the first time, we cannot foresee the effect that may result from it without experience. If we look at a billiard ball, we cannot see anything, any quality that will tell us anything about what its effect could be. Thus, we only find out that one event does in fact follow the other, but we do not find the power that connects them. Next slide, please. Hume now turns to the relation between mind and body in hopes of finding the impression of the idea of power. Now, let's take into account that right now I'm talking, which enables me because of my volition or the command of my will. The command of my will wills my tongue to move, allowing me to speak. Thus, we can say that our volition is the cause. followed by the motion of our body, which is the effect. But then again, where can we find the power or necessary connection that connects both of these? So Hume presents three arguments for these. Number one, if we do perceive any power or necessary connection in our volition or will, then we would have known its connection with the effect and how one operates upon the other. If we think about it, how can the soul, a spiritual substance, affect the body, a material substance? If we perceive the power in our will, then we should also know the mysterious union between the body and soul, which we do not. Now, moving on to the second argument, the authority of will is bound by particular limits. Let's consider voluntary and involuntary movements. Why is it that one can voluntarily move their limbs and fingers, but not their heart and liver? Also, let's consider a healthy person and one who recently lost function in one leg. Both of them are aware of the command of their will to move that certain body part. However, only the healthy person is successful in doing so. If we perceive power in our will, then we should also know why its command is only limited to certain movements. Now, moving on to the third argument, in our bodily movements, if we felt the original power, then we must know it. If we know the power, then we must know its effect to the series of smaller body movements that lead to the desired final movement. Even if our mind only wills our arm to move, there's a series of smaller events that will go on and on and on and lead to the desired and final movement. Thus, we only know that the body's motion is followed by the mind's command of will, but we do not find the power that connects them. Lastly, next slide please. Hume now turns to the mind itself in hopes again of finding the impression of the idea of power. He once again presents three arguments for this. The first one is, if we know a power, then we must also know the quality and the cause which enables it to produce the effect. However, we do not know this power because we don't even feel it, and it's not conceivable in our minds. Next argument is, the command of the mind over itself is limited. Earlier, we established that the will is limited in our body as well as the mind. How is it that we have weaker authority over our sentiments, passions, and emotions compared to our ideas? For example, you can stop yourself from feeling happiness or sadness by the command of your will. But then again, we also have limited authority over our ideas. For example, if you have an assignment due tomorrow, you just can't stop thinking about it. Even if your will commands you to do so, you just can't. Thus, we also cannot find the impression of the idea of power in the mind itself. Now, since we can find the impression of the idea of power in external objects, in the mind and body, and in the mind itself, let's have this. Next slide, please. The generality of mankind resort to reason an invisible intelligent principle for occurrence of unfamiliar events, and this invisible intelligent principle can be God, a deity, the maker, or the supreme being. However, philosophers perceive that even the most familiar events have no power that is comprehensible. Thus, they recourse to occasionalism, which states that the true and direct principle of every effect is not power in nature, but the volition of the supreme being. Next slide, please. However, to resort to occasionalism is to believe that the supreme being is the effect and is the cause and effect in everything. It is the power and cause to every cause and effect. For example, the supreme being is the cause of the union of the soul and body, and that their volition causes the sensation that leads to a movement of a body part. And also, our conception of ideas is nothing but a revelation made to us by the supreme being's volition. And to relate this to the analogy earlier, for example, when a billiard ball is moved by the supreme being's volition, the second billiard ball is moved. However, Hume rejects this and presents two objections. Number one is, if we accept this conclusion, so extraordinary and so far from common life and experience, then we have no reason to trust our own common methods of argument. And the second argument is that we have no idea of the supreme being other than our own reflections from our own faculties. How can we acquire an idea of the supreme being when we ourselves cannot comprehend how our own bodies and faculties operate? What more can we comprehend from something that we lack in experience of? Next slide, please. Now, if we cannot find the impression in external objects in the mind and body and in the mind, and Hume rejects occasionalism, then where can we find the impression of the idea of power? Now, Hume's present this conclusion. When one particular event, in all instances, has been conjoined with another event, We employ reasoning when we expect one event to follow upon the appearance of the other event. Thus, we call one event cause and the other effect, and that their necessary connection arises from the multiple number of similar instances by which one event is followed by the other. Therefore, as I quote David Hume, this connection, therefore, which we feel in the mind, this customary transition of the imagination from one object to its usual attendant, is the sentiment or impression from which we can form the idea of power or necessary connection. And that ends our reporting for this video. Once again, I'm Francis Yael Bondoc.
I'm Arielle and Chua.
I'm Leanne Mae Tanquilut.
Thank you very much for listening.